Welcome to Bayhill Studio. Today I am just going to do a quick demonstration of how I attach my quilt binding, and this is one method, and I will actually, after I show this, show two more ways that you can attach the binding through machine binding. This is not hand binding. So with machine binding, we typically sew excuse me, we typically sew the binding onto the back of the quilt, and then we'll fold it over to the front of the quilt and stitch it to the front. I'm going to demonstrate this first on some printed fabric. I will be using solid fabric for my binding for this quilt. However, it's easier to demonstrate on printed fabric because there is a right and a wrong side. So what you'll do is you will take your fabric, and these are all, the strips are cut 2.5 inches wide. And you'll cut enough strips, the length of the width of fabric, and you'll cut enough of those to go around your entire quilt. For this throw quilt that I'm doing, I believe I cut out 7 strips of 2.5 inch strips of fabric. So these are just 2 small pieces. These are not with the fabric because they are just example pieces, but they are 2.5 inches wide. And what I do is right sides together, I just form this L shape. It's a right angle, right sides together. And then I am going to, let me get a ruler and a pen. And normally I'm not going to draw a line on these. I just do these quickly. But if you're just starting out, you can draw a line from, you're going to ignore this outside corner, ignore that, and you're going to draw a line from this corner to this corner right here, okay? That's where we're going to sew. Now, like I said, I typically just eyeball it, but if you're just starting out and you're nervous about doing this, this is a great, easy thing to do, is just draw a line corner to corner, and then you're going to sew directly on that line. And this is how we attach all of our strips together. So you're going to do this with all of your strips of fabric that you have for the binding. And I'm going to cut about 1/4 inch past that stitching line. And then I will take it to my iron and press this open. We don't want bulk in our binding, so you want to press it open to reduce the bulk, like that. And then you repeat this again with all of your strips of fabric. So again, right sides together. If this was the same fabric, again, I would just do another L shape like this, sew along the diagonal, and then it would extend. And then after you have them all sewn just like this, you're just going to fold in half like that and press the whole length of fabric. Now again, I do 2.5 inches wide on my strips of fabric. Some people prefer 2.25 inch. They like a more narrow binding. So you just have to kind of play with it and figure out what you like. All right. So we have that done. And here is my binding that I have ready to go. Let me get that out of the way. And these are all sewn together, as you can see, and folded in half. So there we go, sewn together, folded in half. And now I'll show you how I actually attach it to the quilt. So I typically like to start, I typically like to have my beginning and end on the bottom of the quilt. This quilt that I'm working on right now doesn't necessarily have a top and bottom. It's pretty non-directional, so I'm not going to worry about that. I am going to go about 1/3 of the way in, and that's where I'm going to start. 1/3 from the edge of my quilt. I'm not being exact, but I want a nice gap that I can sew with to finish off my binding when I'm done. And then I'm going to leave about, I like to leave about 12 inches. You could get away with less. I like to have quite a bit of binding to play with at the end, and you'll see at the end why I do that. Again, you're going to figure out your own exact, how you like to do it. This is just how I like to do it, and then once I show you this, you can kind of adjust it to how you want. Now I've got my raw edges to the raw edges of my quilt back. Again, this is the quilt back, so raw edges to raw edges, and I'm leaving this tail, and I'm going to start stitching 1/4 inch from the edge of the quilt. Okay, now there are so many different ways to do corners, so I'm just going to show you how I like to do my corners. I'm going to stitch to about 1/4 inch from the end of my quilt. So again, I can just mark this. I don't usually mark it, I just eyeball it. You don't have to be exact. 1/4 inch from the end. And then I will stop and cut the thread, and I'll show you what I do next. Okay, so I stopped 1/4 inch from the end, you can see there. And then I like to bring it back. So again, you're making an L shape here. Right there you can see. And I've got this triangle here. And then I just fold this directly over that triangle so that it's straight across this side of my quilt edge. And then what I like to do is just use my fingernail to mark where that triangle is. Okay, so you've got that little bump under there, and I'm just using my fingernail to mark. And then I am going to stitch 1/4 inch, which is just where that triangle line is. 1/4 inch from the edge and at that triangle line. Now, a lot of people don't do that. A lot of people stitch all the way to the edge of the fabric, and that's fine. So again, this is how I like to do the corners, but I don't think that there's any problem with just ignoring this triangle thing that I do and stitching straight to the edge and going down the side, from the edge down to the side. So you can do what you want there, and I suggest try it both ways and see what feels right to you and what you like the look of. So here I am going to start my stitching right about there. That's about 1/4 inch in from the seam, and it's where that triangle edge is that I don't want to stitch over. And again, I usually don't mark it, I just eyeball it. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'll speed this part up for you. I'll stitch along the edge and demonstrate one more corner. Okay, so I'm coming to the corner again, and I'm just going to again stop about 1/4 inch before the edge. And I'll flip my quilt around. So again, I just fold that back so that I form an L shape right here, and then I'm going to fold it directly over itself so that it aligns on this side. And then I just, with my fingernail, mark that triangle and stitch 1/4 inch in close to that edge of that triangle, but not over it. And then I keep going. Okay, so I am on my final edge, and I will show you how I attach the two pieces of binding together as soon as I get there. So I'm just going to stitch about, again, I think I'll leave about 12 inches, maybe just a little bit more of an opening, but about 12 inches is what I like. I like to have enough room to work with, but not so big that it gets out of control. And you'll see when I get there what I mean. So I have this piece and I have this piece. All right, so this is a little bit long. And I could just go ahead and cut it to make it easier to work with. I don't need to do that, but for demonstration purposes, I'll use two shorter pieces. So now what I want to do is take one piece, and I'll do this one piece, and about halfway I will cut. And since this has the seam where I attached another piece, another strip of binding, I can just get rid of that. So I think I'll use that as the place where I cut. Okay. And then I'm going to save this. This is what I cut off. This measures 2.5 inches wide. And so I need that measurement, and I'm just going to put it right over where I cut with the edge meeting this edge, right there. And then I'm going to layer this piece over it. And I like to pull it, I don't want it to be loose. I don't want it to be kind of loose like that. Like pull it snug and tight with just a little bit of tautness there. And then I'm going to cut on this side. Okay, and then I can throw that extra piece away, and I can throw this piece away. So these are overlapping. What I did is I created a 2.5 inch overlap. All right, so now this is the outside. We'll call this the outside of our binding. And when you open it up, this is the inside. I am going to have the outside of both pieces meet and form an L shape. So an easy way to tell is that you've got this V-shaped fold and crease to show your inside. It's folding. You can easily see the inside. And you can, by the fold and the direction of the fold, you can easily see the outside. Whether I have a printed fabric with a right or wrong side, it doesn't matter. There's no right or wrong side, but I can still easily tell the outside from the inside based on the direction of the fold. And I'm going to take those and just form an L shape, just like that. Okay, so let me do that again, nice and slow. So I've got both pieces, and I'm going to put this one out like that, and this one directly over it to form an L shape. Now, once again, just like when I was joining all of these strips, I'm going to ignore this outer corner, and I'm going to sew from this corner to this corner, ignoring this one. When I first started doing this, I got so confused on which corners to sew, and I would often sew this corner to this corner. Ignore that pointy outer corner. And if you can get that in your head, whether you're making these long strips of binding or whether you're attaching this final piece of binding, you're always ignoring this. You're not going to sew on this outer pointy corner. Okay, so you're going to sew from the two inside corners where your L shape is. Okay, so right here and right here. That might not make sense. Just the two inside corners. Ignore this outside corner. And again, you can draw a line. I don't do that. I just eyeball it. And I haven't had any problems. And so now I'm going to rearrange it and lay it flat. And just sew corner to corner. And the way that I can do this by eyeballing it is I keep my eye on this corner when I'm sewing. And by doing that, I'm naturally going to sew straight towards that corner. Okay, and if you're not sure if you got it right, then just pull on it and make sure that you got it right and that you sewed the correct corners together. Mine was correct, and so now I'm going to snip off again about 1/4 inch past. And then I'm just going to finger press this open, this seam open, because again, we don't want the bulk. And now you've got your straight line of binding. So now I'm just going to finish this seam 1/4 inch from the edge, just finish it off. Okay, and then now it's done on the back side. So all that's left to do is flip it over. And then we will stitch close to the edge. So, and you can use special presser feet for this. I just eyeball it and stitch really close to the edge of my binding. Just like that, all the way around. So there you can see the stitching. In fact, let me take it off to get you a little bit closer view. And there you can see the stitching, and I'm going to take that all the way around, and I'll show you how I do the corners as well. Okay, so I'm getting to the corner, and already I've pulled out my corner from the back, and now it's available to use on the front. And what I do is I just make the finger press this kind of straight, and then I fold that other side just over so that it meets right there at the angle. And I'll do another corner to show you, but I'm just going to stitch, and I'm going to stitch about 1 or 2 stitches past the edge, and then pivot and turn. So here we go, just holding this straight for now. And as I get close to the edge, I just fold it over and stitch 1 or 2 stitches past the edge. There we go, and my needle is in place, and I'm just pivoting. Put my presser foot back down and keep going. Okay, so I'm getting towards this close to the corner, so I just kind of pop that out and flatten that so I can show you. Once again, I'm just going to make a straight line like so with my hand, and in doing so I've got this angle here, and I can just flip that angle, that corner over, and I don't want it to be like this where they're apart. I want this tip of the angle to meet right there to form a nice clean L shape. So that's what I'm going for, and then again I will just stitch 1 or 2 stitches past the end and pivot. Oh, I just ran out of bobbin thread, so I will finish this up and show you the finished quilt. Along with, we'll do 1 or 2 more ways of attaching or connecting that binding in the back. There's other ways to do it, and I've got another quilt that I'm working on, and so I will tack that onto this video and show you some other options for finishing that binding, attaching that binding in the back before we sew it over and quilt it. I have another quilt partially bound, and I'm ready to join the seams or the binding in the back. Excuse me, I'm recovering from bronchitis, so I might be coughing just a little bit, and excuse my hands if I'm not sewing. I'm painting and that paint just doesn't want to come off. So here we are. I've got this little piece, and then I've got a longer piece, and I'm going to show you 2 other ways that are easy if you don't feel comfortable yet with the first way that I demonstrated. So one way that's popular, and I'm going to trim this longer piece. I don't want that big long tail, so I'm just going to trim it right about there. So there's still some overlap, but not a lot. And so what you can do with the first way is open one of the sides up and just fold it under, maybe 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, it doesn't matter. And then you would just slide this other piece right in the fold, like that. And you could just sew right along the binding. What you might want to do when the quilt is done is kind of hand stitch or machine stitch right over this part when it's all folded and done, but you don't necessarily even have to do that. So that's one way, is just tuck it in. So by folding this under, you've got a nice edge there, and it will just encase this other piece. So then I would just stitch right along here, 1/4 inch, and then I would flip this to the front side and machine stitch as usual. Another way would be to have these be about the same length or meet up exactly the same. And this way just takes a little bit more fiddling with it. And so what you would do is lay these out, and you would create 2 folds, just like that. Finger press them, and then you would line up those 2 folds together, like so, and stitch right along that line that you've created. And then by doing that, you've created a seam. So let's pretend you have a seam right there. Okay, so it will be like that. You've got a seam there. Again, you'll just stitch right along here and fold it over. So those are 2 ways, easier, simpler ways to do it. But I am going to demonstrate the first way one more time for you. So again, I've got this extra scrap piece that I cut off earlier, and I'm going to lay it right there so that I have a 2.5 inch overlap. And the reason why I have 2.5 inches is because my binding is 2.5 inches wide. And so I want that much of an overlap. If my binding, whatever the width of my binding is, that is what you lay out. So it doesn't matter if my binding is 2.25 inches, I still clip that same 2.25 inch binding, lay it out, and create that overlap. So it looks like I trimmed almost exactly, and so I don't even need to trim anymore. That was just coincidence. So this fabric, unlike the first fabric I used, has a right and a wrong side, and so I did want to show you this one more time with a right and wrong side. So again, I'm going to open up one of the pieces just like that, and then open up the other one and place them right sides together, forming that L shape. And remember, we are going to ignore that outer corner and stitch from corner to corner. And as long as you keep that rule in your mind, you should have a really good success rate with this. Now I'm going to trim this 1/4 inch. I want this extra triangle off, but before I do, I just open it up like that and check and make sure I sewed the right corners. If you accidentally sew the wrong corners, you're going to have to undo all this binding. So just double check, even if you're quite sure, double check, and then you can go ahead and cut off that extra fabric, finger press it open, and then all you've done by doing this is done exactly when you created your long with the binding and you placed all those pieces at an L shape, and like here, just all along. You're just repeating that same technique, except to these pieces that are already partially attached to the quilt. It's the same technique as when you sewed all of your strips together. All right, so now I'm just 1/4 inch. I'm going to show, so 1/4 inch seam right here. Okay, and so now all I need to do is flip this over and sew, but really quickly I did want to show you this label and what I do for this. All I do is cut a 6-inch square of fabric and fold it in half into a triangle. But if you're nervous about your handwriting, I use a permanent, let's see if I can find it. I can't find it right now, but a permanent fabric marker. If you're nervous about that, let me show you what I did. I printed up the paper ahead of time with all the things that I want on it. And then, let's see, I'll get a little piece of fabric to show you. I put this on a light box. If you don't have a light box, just hold it up to a sunny window. It's the same thing. So let's see here. So let's pretend this is my label. And I've pressed it in half. And so I know that I want to write on this half. So I just hold it up to whatever, place the letters wherever I want. I space these out so it's easier for me to work with, but I didn't intend on keeping them spaced out when I wrote. Here's my pen. So then I would hold this up to a window or a light box and just start tracing, just like that. So, and then when I finish this line, I just kind of move it closer to this one because I wanted these kind of close together, like that. And then the next line I wanted those kind of close together. So then I can move this around to position the letters wherever I want them. And then after I did that, let me bring this back. I just put this in the corner and I stitched right here along this long edge. And then I also did a basting stitch along each of these to hold them in place while I bound my quilt. And so then once the binding is done on this side, this will be labeled on that side. So that's a really easy thing, just a little bonus tip for you. So I am going to go ahead and bind the top of this, and I'll film it and just do it at high speed because it's not that exciting. So here we go. Oh, and let me just pause real quick to show you this quilt design. I did this on my Juki machine, just free motion. And these are just big daisies. Why not? I just decided I'm just gonna go for, it's kind of contradictory with the star motif. But I also thought with this scrappy kind of homespun look of this quilt, these daisies were perfect and they were just my mood for the day. So I started out with a circle. And then I just used each section, like I just kind of broke each block mentally into thirds and created a petal in each third. It was a little easier to see on, sorry, I'm just pulling threads as I go. Here, so I did a petal in this block, a petal in the corner, a petal in this square, a petal in each square basically. And then in the stars, I just visualized the same thing. So that's what that is, just free motion giant daisies, and I'm loving them. Okay, so there it is. That's the binding, basically 3 different ways to machine bind or join the binding when you're machine binding your quilt, or even when you're hand binding it, it would be the same method. So that's 3 ways. You can do the overlapping way, which I prefer. I think it gives the most cohesive finish when all my other joints are at an angle. But your joints don't have to be at an angle. If you like a straight line, then I recommend one of the straight line methods for the finishing method for joining them. So if all your other joints are straight, just keep that going to the end and do that. Because I like mine at an angle, and I'll tell you why I like mine at an angle. I just feel like it distributes the bulk. So you've got some of the bulk right here from that seam and some over here. So it just distributes it a little bit better. But honestly, I used to do it straight. That's the only way that I used to know how when I first started. And it's perfectly fine. There is nothing wrong with the straight joint when you're joining your binding pieces together. So I hope you got something out of this and enjoyed learning about these different ways that you can join your binding and bind your quilt. And please ask any questions, or if you have another way that you want to share, add those in the comments, and I'm happy to hear it, and maybe all the viewers can learn from each other on this. All right, have a great day.